Among the stories of the Old Testament, there is one that I find profoundly disturbing and painful to read. To be honest, it is a passage that causes me significant discomfort, and I believe it to be one of the most challenging accounts in the entire Bible. This is not a story to approach lightly or without proper mental and emotional preparation. Before we proceed with this video, I must warn that this story may not be suitable for all audiences and could trigger painful memories for those who have experienced or witnessed violence. This narrative is found in Judges, chapters 19 to 21, and is one of the most tragic and shocking accounts in Scripture. To provide some context, the book of Judges recounts a dark period in Israel's history, a time of leadership crisis and moral decline. Chapter 19 opens with a statement that captures the spiritual and social disorder of the era. In those days, there was no king in Israel. This absence of clear leadership and respect for divine law created an environment where wickedness flourished. Although God had given laws to the people of Israel, they were neither respected nor followed, leading to a cycle of sin and its consequences. It is within this context that we encounter the harrowing story of the Levite and his concubine in the mountains of Ephraim. A Levite, overwhelmed by sadness and frustration, sought to reconcile with his concubine, who had left him in anger, and returned to her father's house in Bethlehem. After 4 months of separation, the Levite decided to make amends. He packed his belongings, prepared his servant, and set out for Bethlehem. Upon arriving, the Levite was warmly welcomed by the woman's father, who invited him to stay and rest. The father persuaded the Levite to remain for 5 days, offering food, drink, and hospitality. On the 5th day, despite the father's pleas to stay one more night, the Levite, his concubine, and his servant decided to leave, determined to cover some distance before nightfall, as they had a long journey ahead. As the day progressed, the group approached Gibeah, Jerusalem, a city inhabited by foreigners. The Levite, wary of staying among strangers, chose instead to press on to Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. When they arrived in Gibeah, they found the streets empty, and no one offered them hospitality, a great dishonor in Israel at the time. Eventually, an elderly man from the region of Ephraim, who was residing in Gibeah, saw the weary travelers and invited them into his home. He took care of their needs, providing food and drink. The Levite, his concubine, and his servant finally felt at ease, unaware of the horrors that awaited them that night. As darkness fell, men from the city of Gibeah surrounded the house, demanding that the Levite be handed over to them for vile purposes. The old man, pleading with the mob to refrain from such wickedness, offered his own daughter and the Levite's concubine instead. Desperate and afraid, the Levite sent his concubine out to the men. The mob seized her, and she endured unimaginable torment throughout the night. At dawn, she collapsed near the entrance of the house. When Levite opened the door, he found her lifeless on the threshold. Heartbroken, he lifted her onto his donkey and began the somber journey home, knowing that her death demanded justice. Once back in Ephraim, consumed by grief and anger, the Levite made a shocking decision. He divided the body of his concubine into 12 pieces and sent one piece to each tribe of Israel. This brutal act served as a grim message to awaken the tribes of Israel to the horror and sin that had occurred in Gibeah. When the tribes received the gruesome packages, they were horrified. The Levite recounted the events of that tragic night, urging the leaders of Israel to unite against such evil. The tribes gathered at Mizpah, where they swore to confront the Benjamites of Gibeah for the crime that had defiled their land. The united tribes demanded that the Benjamites hand over the wicked men of Gibeah to face justice. However, the tribe of Benjamin refused, choosing instead to defend their fellow tribesmen despite the gravity of their crimes. The standoff escalated as both Israel and Benjamin prepared for war. Faced with Benjamin's defiance, the leaders of Israel turned to the Lord for guidance. They asked if they should go to battle against their own kin, and the Lord instructed them to proceed, promising justice for the woman who had been wronged. With heavy hearts, the Israelite soldiers readied themselves for a civil war, pitting brother against brother. Israel's army, numbering 400,000, marched against Benjamin's much smaller force of 26,000. Confident in their numerical advantage, the Israelites launched an attack on the Benjamites at Gibeah. However, the Benjamites fought with fierce determination and, despite their smaller numbers, inflicted heavy casualties on Israel. By the end of the day, Israel had lost 22,000 men. Shaken and grieving the lives lost, the tribes retreated and cried out to the Lord, questioning the justice of their cause. Yet, their resolve remained firm. Israel regrouped, knowing they had to continue the fight to purge the evil from their land. Determined not to waver, Israel once again sought the Lord's guidance. Assured of his support, they returned to the battlefield. However, despite their prayers and preparations, the warriors of Benjamin remained relentless. Israel suffered another devastating loss, with over 18,000 men killed, plunging them into despair. Overwhelmed by the bloodshed, the Israelites gathered at Bethel, fasting and weeping before the Lord. They offered sacrifices and earnestly sought his guidance, troubled by the apparent futility of their efforts. Once more, the Lord affirmed their mission, promising that he would deliver Benjamin into their hands. After 2 crushing defeats, Israel devised a new strategy. They set an ambush around Gibeah, aiming to lure Benjamin's forces out of the city. A smaller contingent engaged the Benjamites at the city entrance, pretending to retreat to draw them out. Confident in their apparent victory, the Benjamites pursued the fleeing Israelites, leaving the city vulnerable. At that moment, Israel's hidden forces sprang into action, catching Benjamin off guard. The defenses of Gibeah collapsed as Israel's army surrounded the Benjamites, initiating a decisive battle. The ambush succeeded, and Israel overwhelmed Benjamin's forces, bringing devastation to Gibeah. Flames consumed the city as Israel's wrath burned hot. Benjamin's army was nearly annihilated, with only 600 men managing to escape into the wilderness. The leaders of Israel mourned the tragic cost of the conflict, realizing that an entire tribe was now on the brink of extinction. The brutality of the civil war weighed heavily on them, and they lamented the lives lost and the fractured unity among the tribes. Adding to their sorrow was a solemn vow they had made. They had sworn not to give their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites. This oath now presented a grave dilemma, as they realized that without wives, the surviving Benjamites would perish, erasing a tribe from Israel entirely. The leaders of Israel wrestled with the challenge of preserving the tribe of Benjamin while honoring their solemn vow. Desperate for a solution, they devised a plan to provide wives for the Benjamite survivors without violating their oath. Seeking to balance justice with mercy toward their fellow Israelites, they turned their attention to Jabesh-Gilead, a city that had not joined them in the battle against Benjamin. The men of Jabesh-Gilead were killed, but the women who had not been with a man were spared. A total of 400 women were taken and offered as wives to the 600 Benjamite survivors. However, this number was insufficient to provide for all the men. The leaders of Israel continued to seek a way to ensure Benjamin's survival, knowing that maintaining the unity of Israel was essential, and that God's promise of preserving all the tribes must be fulfilled. During a festival to the Lord held in Shiloh, the leaders proposed another plan. They instructed the Benjamites to hide and, at the appropriate moment, seize unmarried women dancing at the festival to take them as wives. Although unconventional, this solution allowed Israel to avoid directly breaking their oath while ensuring wives for the Benjamite men. Through these actions, Benjamin's survival was secured, preserving the unity and continuity of Israel's tribes. The Benjamites followed the plan, taking wives from the daughters of Shiloh. Although painful and imperfect, this solution ensured the survival of the tribe of Benjamin. The leaders of Israel accepted it as a way to begin healing the nation's wounds. With new wives and a secured future, the Benjamites returned to their land to rebuild what had been destroyed. They mourned their losses, but worked to restore their cities, re-establishing homes and communities. The people of Israel watched with mixed emotions as Benjamin rose from the ashes. The scars of the civil war remained, but the tribes pledged to preserve their unity under God's covenant. They resolved to learn from the pain and tragedy, dedicating themselves through prayer and sacrifice to a future of peace and obedience. They vowed to prevent such division and committed to honoring God's commands. With humility and reverence, they sought to build a society founded on unity and justice, avoiding a repeat of the calamities they had endured. This story is among the darkest and most unsettling in the Bible. It illustrates a time of moral chaos when, as repeatedly stated in the book of Judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The cycle of violence, the degradation of women, and the collapse of social and spiritual norms revealed the depth of corruption that had overtaken Israel. There was no regard for human dignity, and God's law had been utterly abandoned. Reflecting on this narrative requires understanding its historical and cultural context. The period of the Judges was a transitional era for Israel, marked by fragmented leadership and a lack of centralized authority. Judges arose sporadically to address specific crises, but the root problem ran deeper. The people had turned away from God and rejected His covenant. Their actions mirrored their spiritual distance. The concubine, who suffered unimaginable brutality, symbolizes more than an individual victim. She represents Israel's spiritual condition at the time. Just as her body was dismembered and sent to the tribes, so too was Israel's social and spiritual body fractured. The violence against her reflected the broader violence the people inflicted on one another by rejecting God's covenant and abandoning the principles meant to guide them. This passage forces us to confront difficult questions about human nature and evil. How could the men of Gibeah commit such atrocities? How could the Levite, who was meant to represent God, hand over his concubine to be sacrificed in his place? What does this reveal about the moral state of that society, where women were treated as property and sexual violence was used as a tool of power? These questions do not have easy answers, but they point to the urgent need for spiritual and moral renewal, something that Israel would eventually seek through the institution of monarchy and a return to God's law. The book of Judges ends with the phrase, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes." This isn't just a political observation, but a comment on the spiritual condition of a nation that had turned away from its true king, God. As we meditate on this story, we are also invited to reflect on the times in which we live. Although our circumstances are different, we still face similar challenges of injustice, violence, and the devaluation of human life. The story of the Levite and his concubine serves as a somber reminder of the consequences of a world that strays from justice, compassion, and respect for human dignity. It calls us to examine ourselves and our society, asking whether we are living according to God's principles, or if, like the people of Israel in that time, we are simply doing what seems right in our own eyes. When revisiting this story, it is crucial not to view it merely as a relic of the past. While the brutality and violence are shocking, the spiritual and moral lesson it conveys is timeless. What happened in Gibeah is a reminder of what can occur when people turn away from God, and a call to urgently restore justice, compassion, and respect for divine commandments in our lives and communities. The story of the Levite and his concubine is difficult to read because it forces us to face evil in its most raw and devastating form. Yet, it also serves as a warning, showing us the consequences when a society forgets God. What we witness in Judges 19 is the extreme end of a moral decline that began long before with small acts of disobedience and transgressions, which gradually escalated into something uncontrollable. In Judges, we see a people who, upon distancing themselves from God, fall into a cycle of sin, suffering, and repentance, only to relapse into sin once again. They forget who they are, God's chosen people, and this leads them into a deep spiritual crisis. That is why the story of Levite's concubine cannot be viewed in isolation. It is part of a larger narrative about the dangers of straying from a covenant with God. Looking at our own reality, this passage challenges us to reflect on how we treat the people around us, especially the most vulnerable. Are we valuing and protecting human dignity, or are we in some way allowing injustice and violence to thrive in our communities? Are we living by the principles of love and justice that God has given us, or are we, like the people in the time of the Judges, simply doing what seems right in our own eyes? This is a question each of us must answer, both individually and collectively. While Judges 19:21 may be one of the darkest stories in the Bible, it is also a powerful warning about the consequences of turning away from God and the urgent need to restore justice, love, and respect for human life in our world.